Hi everybody, this is your video on Tomas Rivera's And the Earth Did Not Devour Him, our book for this week. I've got my little buddy here with me. He's going to make video. He promises to be good and not distract us. We're just sitting in the chair. This book is sort of continuing our timeline of events in a different direction. Last week we looked at Maxine Hong Kingston's book, and we looked at the specifics of transoceanic, transgenerational immigration. Rivera's book is going to take us in a little bit geographic area of difference, as well as bringing up some different things about migration within a country. If you're not familiar with Tomas Rivera's 1971 book, you'll notice that the first half is written in Spanish and the second half is written in English. Of course, we're going to want to read only the English. They're the same version of story, just in different languages. What it is, I'll tell you a little bit about how it works, and then we'll get into some of it as an introduction here. What it is it's a series of sort of vignettes or short pieces that are all related to one another by virtue of being imagined or remembered by one young boy who narrates the beginning and the end of all of these sort of memory-driven pieces. The subject that it's looking at is migrant farm workers who happen to be traveling throughout the country, various parts of the country, in relation to labor issues, working, traveling for work, all within the United States. The main character and his family are Mexican Americans who live in South Texas and who are throughout the year in other parts of the country as necessary by their particular lifestyle. Now, Rivera himself grew up in the South Texas Valley in Crystal City, and he was born to migrant farm workers. His parents were migrant farm workers. He and his peers also would have joined their parents in the fields to help and to experience the very, very manual labor of this particular life. And all of the images that he describes for us, the dramatic ones, the more mundane ones, the briefly funny ones, all of these are images based on his own particular life. So what this book brings to our class discussion that's a little bit different is a cultural interchange that is more largely divided by ethnicity and not so much nationality. When I've taught this book in the past, I always make it a point to signify the national identity of these migrant workers who happen to be very much Americans. So many students might perceive them as being Mexican immigrants, but instead they are American citizens who themselves are migrating throughout the country because of the need to find work and the types of work that they will be doing. The important thing to consider when looking at this book, which was published in 1971, is what era it is published into, what is going on at this time. And in terms of the American landscape, we are right at the end or at the onset of an evolution of civil rights in regards to both race and ethnicity and issues of labor. The Chicano movement, capital C, capital M, which is largely defined by labor reforms, educational and student reforms, and political presence and social activism. The Chicano movement was the Latino-focused portion of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the late 1960s in the United States. And Rivera was writing as a poet and as a short story writer and as a intellectual during this time, and published this book looking at the particular plight of Mexican Americans or Chicanos in the country as being largely second-class citizens in his eyes. And he uses his own experience growing up in the early part of the 20th century alongside his parents and their own hardships as a way to sort of reflect and represent to multiple audiences what that experience was like. The audience in Spanish, crafted specifically for somebody who would know these experiences, and then in English, perhaps delivering this story to others who are not aware what's going on in the United States. So that Chicano movement era is the time frame in which this story appears. It makes its appearance. It from the get-go is well received. It's the sort of touchstone of migrant labor literature from this time, and everything that comes after that is reminiscent of this particular sort of landmark publication. Rivera himself is widely known because of this publication. The book has been made into a film version that's very difficult to come by. I'll see if I can find a link to portions of it or something so that you can see the film adaptation. But what Rivera was doing, as I mentioned earlier, was trying to represent as much of the migrant workers' experience as he could just by opening into this young boy's visions of the world around him. And sometimes the young boy narrator that begins in the Lost Year section at the beginning, he'll sort of dip in here and there, and he might be this boy and he might be that boy, or it might be other versions of that boy telling the stories in particular areas. They're all sort of happening in the same environment, in the same world, but not always being told by or about the same exact character. And it's a style that allows Rivera to speak to and comment on lots of different elements, from poverty to degradation to sort of absurd melodrama and hope and racism all mixed together and leading to something that is a complete as possible representation of the experience. Some of the other things that this brings up, and we'll look at this in terms of when this is published as well, is that the time that he's looking at, the middle part of the 20th century, is a huge time in the Mexican American and Mexican national manual labor movement, oftentimes referred to as the Bracero program, BRACERO program, which is organized by the government to contract with workers in order to do many of these jobs, these manual labor jobs, from picking fruits and planting and all of these things that take massive amounts of human labor, cheap labor, and to have them contracted in the place of having these done by undocumented workers. And this program is a result of the boom in the economy of the United States after the Second World War. And the Braceros program, which is referring to arms, in brazos is arms in Spanish, and the workers involved in these programs are largely workers who use their arms rather than, how do we want to say, white collar jobs. These are blue collar manual labor jobs that this program services. And as I was saying, it's in response to the growing economic uptick in the United States because of and after World War II. Prior to that, going back another generation, during the 1930s in the United States, the Great Depression largely has many of these workers removed from the country as a result of deportation, forced deportation, which was collectively called, in a much more euphemistic term, repatriation, but in fact was forced removal, sending them back to their country. Why? Because the economy was depressed. It was widely known that there were few employment opportunities. The land was in horrible shape. Many people were suffering and starving, and so one way to direct any sort of remedy was to try to remove people who may or may not have been in this country and that would have come here from Mexico or other parts of Central America. And so during the 1930s and right up until the beginning of the Second World War, many of these Mexicans, Americans or Mexican nationals, were actually removed forcibly. And it didn't matter sometimes if they were citizens of the United States or not. There was just cause in their minds to do this removal in order to supposedly provide a better economic situation for white Americans and those who were not of Mexican nationality or descent. And so this causes a huge movement of Mexicans back to Mexico. And when the jobs and the economy turned around and there were need for these people, the government by and large sought ways to make it an official program rather than a program run by people's handshakes and undocumented workers sort of streaming into the job market. And so they started this program. And many of those working during that time would have been working on contracts where they were required to register, to have medical exams, to remain in the United States only for a certain amount of time. All of this as a means of keeping tabs and keeping an organized labor force that was cheap and economical and, as they saw it, an advantage to the workers who could take these jobs. Now, that wasn't always the case, and not all these workers necessarily represented in Rivera's book are part of that program, but certainly it's a nod to that era and to the children and the generation who came after that Braceros program era. Now, the Braceros program runs until the mid to late 1950s as a way to sort of keep that relationship established. And what was common, Leo, you can't come back in here, you're jumping on me too much. What was common during that time was, as Rivera's depicting here, traveling workers who would move from camp to camp, and these camps were very shoddy and often not well kept up in terms of seasonal labor. They would move many miles, and they would have contracts in place where their boss would engage with landowners in these particular parts of the country that might need work for a few weeks or a few months, and then they might go back to their homes in other parts of the country, and then they would move north and do the work that needed to be done in those areas. And so it creates a massive amount of movement within the country, and all of the issues that we've talked about in terms of groups of people moving across borders and moving, being forced to move because of danger and trauma, or leaving a country and moving thousands of miles across the sea. All of those sort of general issues are also at play in moving within one's country. And we see it reflected here. You have the culture shock, yes. You have the linguistic barriers, yes. But you've also got these sort of in and out group mentalities that we've mentioned in the last few lectures about defining who is most American and how, and what means we use to define them. Can you say hi? And now go over there with Ella, please. And by creating those in and out groups, we define who we are by largely defining who we are not. And the subjects of Rivera's book experience that in a variety of different ways. Now, I'll come back later this week with a second video as you've read a little bit more of Rivera's, and I'll start talking more about the specific stories. But some of the things you're going to see are very, very dramatic and graphically portrayed in their sort of snapshots interspersed amongst these larger, more narrative pieces. And it's really a nice stylistic structure by Rivera to represent images through words. And many of the short stories read like poems, like tone poems, creating a particular frozen moment. And some of the longer ones, build on ideas that have been brought up in other stories. You're going to see a lot of common elements in some of the stories. Certainly hardship in the face of hope, and how not to lose hope. The title story, in fact, is largely about this, not losing hope. The earth did not open up to swallow this young man who was about to lose hope. He was going to question and challenge God for the life that he's given them, and he was just about to do it, and he saw that the earth was rising up to take him, but then it swelled back down, and he learns that challenging and questioning the life that he's been given and the life that his parents have always told him about is not going to crush him. And so, in keeping with the spirit that the Chicano movement civil rights era created for them, he understands that they can determine their own life for themselves rather than simply having to live the life that they've always lived. And this is a wonderful theme right on through the end. The last story, which I won't spoil for you too much, but it projects this sense of constant moving towards something. The last narrative story is this piece called When We Arrive, and it's a multi-voice narrative. It's told by different voices moving, because the characters in this collection, they're always moving. They're migrant. They have homes, yes, but their existence is always in motion. And so this idea of always arriving, always potentially arriving at the next stop, somehow they're going to get there, etc., is played for when that day will come, what will likely await them as a means of hope on the horizon. And there's a tremendous generality we can make about all diasporic people, people who have moved or been moved throughout, their own countries or across borders or across oceans. There's always this sense of continually arriving. Well, what's at the end of that arrival process? I'll leave you with that introduction for today. A little bit later this week, I'll dig into some of these stories a little bit more deeply, and I'll let you know when that video is ready. Thanks a lot. Sorry for the kids and the dogs.